Okay, hello Year 10. Hope you had a good Easter. What I've decided to do is go over some of the lessons that were in Booklet 1, so the last few lessons, so from lesson 8 through to 10, just because you were away when we did these lessons. I think it's worth us going over them just to consolidate the understanding. Some of these, particularly these last few lessons, are particularly important. So what I thought I'd do is just go over the Mormons again. So you were in school when we did this lesson. In fact, this was your flip learning homework, looking at the journey of the Mormons. So if you remember, you looked at the experiences of the Donner Party, and we were analysing the problems going west. So in the early settlement of the West, the 1830s and 40s and early 50s, the main reasons why so many travellers found it difficult to actually get west. And we know that the Donner Party, due to a lack of preparation, due to a lack of coordination, struggled to get west, and many of them died. You were also asked to look at the Mormons, and the Mormons are particularly important because the Mormons are an example of a group of migrants who successfully reach their destination, the Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake, and they will form and build a city there, Salt Lake City, which is over here. So I thought what I'd do is first is just very quickly recap the reasons why the Mormons go west in the first place. So this is kind of just consolidating knowledge that you should already know, and it'll help us understand why they go west, and particularly the importance of their eventual leader, Brigham Young. Okay, so just to start, some of you may have watched the Book of Mormon, the musical, and it all starts here in New York with a man called Joseph Smith. It says down here, he's the man who he has the kind of the dream about the golden plates, the Book of Mormon, and this is where the kind of this strand of Christianity is going to start. They obviously are quite controversial in the fact that they believe that they are the chosen people of God within Christianity, which outraged many other versions of Christianity in the United States. They're quite religious over there. They were anti-slaves, so they didn't believe in slavery as well, which at the time caused a lot of controversy. And obviously we know that they believe in polygamy as well, so more than one wife, which again caused a lot of outrage amongst lots of Christian communities in the United States at the time. Smith and the Mormons are driven out of New York. We're talking about the 1820s here, 1830s, and they go to Ohio, Kirtland, and this is where he sets up their first holy city. They set up a bank, and as you may remember, there is an economic depression in 1837, and the Mormon bank crashes, and lots of people lose their savings. Lots of people blame the Mormons for the loss of their savings because of the hostility they have towards the Mormons, because of those religious beliefs, those controversial religious beliefs. So they're driven out of Ohio and they find themselves in Missouri, over here. Now, Missouri is technically a Confederate state, and during the Civil War, they fight for the Confederacy. The Mormons have anti-slavery sentiment, so they're very, very unpopular. They also have their own police force called the Sons of Dan, which are also unpopular. So they're eventually driven out of Missouri, and they find themselves here in Nauvoo, in Illinois. Now, Nauvoo in Illinois is where Brigham Young, the eventual leader of the Mormons, was at that time. He'd led some Mormons to Nauvoo in a very in a well-planned kind of route there. So that's already showing the kind of evidence that Brigham Young will be quite significant to preparation of journeys. Once in Nauvoo, they set up something called the Nauvoo Legion, again, their own kind of police force, which is deeply unpopular. And eventually, Smith claims that he's going to run for the presidency. He's shot dead, he's assassinated in 1844. From that, Brigham Young will kind of take over as leader of all of the Mormons. What Brigham Young will do is he will negotiate a deal with the United States government. They don't particularly want the Mormons in the East, so he arranges with the United States government that they will go to this area here, the Salt Lake, an area of the West which is unsettled, and unsettled for a number of reasons, and we'll look at that in detail in a few seconds. So if we just move down here, you were then asked to kind of look at why their journey west was so successful. And there's a couple of things I just want to kind of point out here. Eventually, there's around 2,700 to 3,000 Mormons make the journey west. Eventually, 700 will die. So it's not by all means a straightforward journey. They'll die of disease, such as plague, on their way, because it is such a long and harsh journey. The key things to note, though, is Brigham Young is a brilliant organizer. He knows this journey west needs to be massively prepared. There needs to be lots of resources, and everyone needs to have clear roles. And they need to know those roles, and they need to do them to make sure that they actually get west and people survive. Because as we know, it is a very difficult journey. So one thing he does is he sends, they're called the Pioneer Band, and he sends these people ahead of the rest of the group, and they are able to kind of clear out the route. They're able to scout ahead. They're able to find food, just making sure the journey runs as successful as possible. So the Pioneer Band are really important. He also kind of subdivides the amount of people who were there as well. So there's lots of wagons, obviously. Here are the wagons, and they're carrying all the supplies. He splits them up into teams of 100, and then within that, there's one person in charge of 100 wagons, and then within that, they subdivide that into 10. So there's one person in charge of 10 wagons as well, and everyone has a clear role there as well, making it very, very organised. Obviously, it's a long journey, and by June of 1846, they got to the Missouri River. Even though it was summer, Brigham Young understood that the journey was going to take a long time. So what they decided to do was they decided to stop. And here he built the winter quarters. And they built 1,000 cabins, and they stop and they wait out the winter. Only by spring of 1847 do they then start the journey again. They go via the South Paths, as we know, discovered by the mountain men. They follow the route of the Donner but they then go, obviously, their way to the Salt Lake. Eventually, by the end of 1847, 2,000 Mormons have arrived at the Salt Lake. So that's what the Flip Learning Homework was. So as you can see, Missouri, they go all the way here, across the Rocky Mountains to the Salt Lake here as well. So why were they so successful? And we've already kind of talked about some of those reasons, and it is mainly down to this man here, Brigham Young. He's the leader of the Mormons. So here's a couple of words that suit Brigham Young and the reasons why they're successful. So charismatic, he's committed, he's dedicated, and he's massively organised. And for me, that's the key one, really. How organised Brigham Young is really is the main reason why they're able to get to the Salt Lake. So the activity is kind of going over what I've just talked about. So here you can see the wagons were built, they were organised, they had equipment, they had food, they had oxen to pull the wagons, they subdivided the wagons, they had the Pioneer Band, they had the winter quarters. So here, the feature of what you need to do is the feature of his leadership. So using the kind of words that we've looked at there, what word suits? I mean, here is all about preparation, really. That's the kind of key thing. His preparation. What you need to do, read through here, and then you just need to explain why that feature of his leadership is so important. Well, make links to the Donner Party. Without this preparation, could they have made that journey west? If they decided not to stop at the Missouri River for the winter quarters, what would have happened? Think about the Donner Party. The Donner Party pushed on during the winter, and they found themselves lost in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and many of them died of starvation and of cold. So this is just where you briefly explain why that feature of Brigham Young is important. Same again for this part here. So obviously it talks a bit more about some of the food as well. Have a look. What did they do? Why is that important? Here's the word. Put it in again there as well. So similar activity. So once you've done that, that's kind of looking at his importance on the journey. You look at the Salt Lake. And this is good because you can see the image here in colour as well. This is the Great Salt Lake. This is what the Mormons would have come to. So what you need to do is really think, what's the problem? What are the problems of settling here? And it's kind of similar to that very first lesson we did when we looked at why white Americans didn't want to go west, why they called it the Great American Desert. So you can see there's clearly a lack of water. Yeah, it's the Salt Lake, but it's salt water. You can't drink it. Where's all the raw materials? There's no building materials here. So first of all, how are they going to drink water? The land isn't very, it doesn't look very fertile. How are they going to grow crops? How are they going to feed themselves in the long term? Again, how are they going to build shelter? Where's the fuel coming from? How are they going to make, fire? Who gets what? When they get to this Salt Lake, who's going to settle what? Who's going to get what land? So these are all the big problems that Brigham Young faced. So with that in mind, you need to then consider his solution. So very similar to the homestead lesson that you may have done. They had lots of problems. Here are the solutions. So we'll just kind of model one together first. So the Mormons used something called Spanish bricks to build houses. So these are bricks made from earth, which were dried in the sun. So they dig up the ground, dig up the earth, they dry out these bricks in the sun. They used to use this kind of technique a lot in ancient Egypt as well, actually. So what does this overcome the problem of? Well, this overcomes the problem of the materials, as there was a lack of wood. On the Salt Lake. Have a look at the next one. Mormons built irrigation systems for fresh water from streams that ran from the mountains into the Great Salt Lake. So kind of almost like a kind of little canal that goes from the mountains where there's fresh water all the way down to the Salt Lake. So that gives them the fresh water. And again, so then what they can do is they've got fresh drinking water. Then the irrigation ditch would then connect to farmland. They can then start to grow crops. They're there to stay. They need to be able to grow crops in the long term as well. So again, what did that overcome the problem of? Explain it overcomes the problem of having fresh water and being able to grow crops as well on fertile land. And then you've got the other two here as well that you will read through as well. And what does that overcome the problem of? Little extension there too. So eventually that's what the Salt Lake will look like. So they will grid it out. So they'll have grids. It'll be a really organized city with the clear roles just like on the way there as well. Don't worry about the exam question for now, but here's a good little revision technique for you to look at. So Salt Lake, and it's got all the problems and then it's got all the solutions here for Lake as well. Make sure you do the lesson summary. Just consider, the main things to consider is the organization and dedication of Brigham Young, which enabled the Mormons to get west in the first place. The problems that they had in settling the Salt Lake and the solutions that Brigham Young came up with, and then the fact that they were able to then settle there in Salt Lake City in Utah. And it's still a major city today in the United States. Okay, thank you for listening. Hope that was helpful.